The U.S. has resumed military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine after Kyiv said it is ready to accept a 30-day ceasefire with Russia. Now, this comes after the high-level face-to-face talks in Saudi Arabia that we reported yesterday. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the deal will now be presented to Russia. But it remains unclear if Moscow will agree to the terms. Holly Williams brings us more from Kyiv.
It is a confusing time for American diplomacy. After yesterday's meeting in Saudi Arabia, the US now appears to be back in Ukraine's corner and calling on Russia to agree to a 30-day ceasefire. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, made it clear that the ball is now in Russia's court, saying, quote, "I hope they're going to say yes. If they say no, then we'll unfortunately know what the impediment is to peace here." Yet just last month, President Trump called Ukraine's elected president a dictator before publicly berating him at the White House and then suspending US security assistance and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Both of those are crucial to this country's military, which has been fighting off a Russian invasion for more than 3 years. Following the talks in Saudi Arabia, that pause has now been lifted, and the president's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is expected to head to Russia for talks later this week. And as the Trump administration continues to push for a ceasefire in Ukraine, there's another sign of diplomatic wheels turning. According to Russian media reports, the director of the CIA, John Ratcliffe, recently spoke by telephone with his Russian counterpart. Back to you.
All right, Holly, thank you for that. For more on efforts to secure a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia, you are looking at, next to me, former U.S. Ambassador John Herbst. He's the senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and also served as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine during the George W. Bush administration. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for joining us today. As we've been discussing, Secretary Rubio says the ball is now in Russia's court. Sources telling CBS News President Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, will meet with Putin in Moscow. What are your predictions from those meetings?
Well, again, it's not a surprise that the ball is now in Russia's court. They're the aggressor in this war. Ukraine has always shown, including since Trump won the election, it was ready to compromise for peace. Russia's yet to show that. So now there's proof positive in the form of this ceasefire agreement. Witkoff is heading to Moscow. It's clear that Putin is trying to charm Witkoff. A man who's never had diplomatic experience gets to see Putin twice now within the space of, 5 or so weeks. And I suspect Putin's going to try and charm him into suggesting, well, you have to make this change or that change before Russia can agree. You had in Saudi Arabia just now, basically the United States presenting its plan to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians said yes. As Russian legislator Kosachev said yesterday, Russia will set the terms of peace, not the United States. We'll see how the Trump administration reacts to that.
What is your view on what's really happening here? Because before the Saudi Arabia meeting, Secretary Rubio said both sides need to make concessions, but I've yet to see the U.S. detail concessions that Russia needs to make. What concessions have you seen Russia suggest so far? And if there aren't any, what's really going on here?
Your analysis is absolutely right. Again, Zelensky signaled before President Trump was inaugurated that he's willing to compromise on territory. The Trump ideas have said that, to make any ceasefire or peace stable or sustainable, you need to have European forces deployed to Ukraine. Russia needs to understand that the United States and our allies would be arming Ukraine. And Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, Peskov, the spokesman for Putin, have categorically rejected those terms. So thus far, the Russians say they're willing to compromise without offering anything concrete. I can't tell you why the administration went through the fiction that both sides have to compromise. That's not a fiction. And Ukraine is not willing to compromise because Ukraine always signaled that willingness. Perhaps this is a way to say to Putin, well, look, we've gone the extra mile for you. Now it's your turn to compromise. That's a possible interpretation, but not the only one.
All right, Ambassador Herbst, we appreciate you joining us this morning. Thanks for joining us from Virginia.
My pleasure. Thank you.